Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 204, William Ogilvie. Warning: this episode contains themes that may be distressing for some. William Frederick Ogilvie was only 48 when he died due to suicide in 1920. His estate was worth £50,000 and he was described as a wealthy squatter. William Ogilvie was the eldest child of Edward David Stewart Ogilvie and Theodosia Isabel de Burgh. Edward Ogilvie, William's father, was born in London and he was the son of William Ogilvie. William Ogilvie had been born in 1782 at Holborn Hill, England, and he fought in the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805 in Spain. Edward joined the Royal Navy at the age of 12 and married Mary White on the 10th of May 1812 at St George the Martyr at Southwark, Surrey, England. They had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, but 2 sons died before they reached their mid-40s, leaving William Ogilvie's father, Edward, and Edward's sister, Mary. Edward retired from active service in the Royal Navy in 1814 at the age of 32, and he arrived in Australia as a free settler in 1825 on the convict ship Granada with Mary and their 4 children. There were 9 other passengers. To Mary and the children, ship life was a very different experience. To William Ogilvie, though, it was familiar, as he knew this world well. The ship's surgeon, who doubled as a convict superintendent, was the Scotsman Peter Cunningham. This was Cunningham's 4th voyage to New South Wales. He was an intelligent man with wide interests. His later book, 2 Years in New South Wales, became an English bestseller upon its publication in 1827, and it remains the fullest contemporary account of life in the new colony during that period. Cunningham and the Ogilvie family became lifelong friends. Jim Belshaw posted this information online. Soon after arrival and accompanied by ship surgeon Peter Cunningham, William Ogilvie sailed up the coast to Kingstown, now known as Newcastle in New South Wales, before travelling further up the valley to select land. After making his selection, he brought his family to Newcastle and then he returned to the Upper Hunter to establish a dwelling for them. When Peter Cunningham and William Ogilvie arrived at Newcastle on the Lord's Liverpool's weekly service from Sydney, they found there were no horses available. They walked from there to the Upper Hunter, and they walked around the area that they saw especially interesting, and then walked back to Newcastle. William established a piece of land in the Upper Hunter and called it Merton, after the village in England where Lord Nelson had built a house for his mistress, which was a scandal of English society, and it's where the Ogilvies had lived just prior to their departure to New South Wales. At the time William took up his grant, he was undercapitalised. The grant itself was 2,000 acres, too small to be properly viable. Economic survival was a battle, one that many lost. As he built the stock numbers up, the family occupied new land beyond the grant, thus becoming squatters. In Peter Cunningham's book, The 2 Years in New South Wales, it says, Mr. Ogilvie possesses here 6,000 acres consisting of alluvial flats and lightly timbered forest land. A plain of 50 acres of rich land without a tree upon it is situated in the middle of the grant, overlooked by a beautiful swelling hill, equally clear, of the finest sort of garden mould, and covered with luxuriant grasses. The Goulburn River enters Hunter's River opposite to the bottom of Mr. Ogilvie's grant, the plains on each side being hemmed in by woody ridges of moderate elevation, toward which the backland gradually rises. Contrary to what is generally found in other parts of the country, the ridges upon the upper part of the Hunters River are almost uniformly flattened at the top, forming little miniature hills and valleys covered with fine soil of moderate depth and bounding in grass, which makes them the great resort of kangaroos and cattle in the winter season. A private village named Merton verged on his property. It was isolated but largely self-sufficient. Aside from cattle and sheep, dairying and viticulture was also practised. In 1841, the population of Merton was recorded at 137. Merton became the centre of a designated police district that was called Merton, and Ogilvie was appointed a magistrate. The town of Denman now occupies the portion that was part of Ogilvie's Merton estate, and only the homestead and remnants of the Merton cemetery survive. Denman lies 25 kilometres west of Muswellbrook. In the early 1800s, the area was known as Jerry's Plain, by which it is still known today along the Golden Highway. A description of the first house built at Merton was written by Ellen Ogilvie, later Ellen Bundock, one of the daughters of William Ogilvie, and she said the house which our father had prepared for us at Merton was a small four-roomed cottage, whitewashed nicely as piped clay was found close by, white and buff. Our mother was greatly pleased and very happy at joining our father in this little house, which was charming. Small as our home was, there was room to receive constant visitors. Our mother had the knack of making all around her charmingly pretty and picturesque, as well as fresh and clean. At first we had only earthen floors made by Irishmen, who broke up the earth until it was powdered, and then, when whitewashed, it made good firm flooring that was very troublesome to keep clean. Subsequently the floors were laid down in wood, and by degrees the house was added to. In Squatter's Castle, George Farwell describes the relationship between the Ogilvies and the Aboriginal tribe of the district. He says the area was heavily peopled with Aborigines at that time, and the Ogilvies treated them well and encouraged their children to do the same, a habit that Edward Ogilvie had throughout his life. It was here that Edward learnt the natives' language, a fact that was to save his life on at least 2 occasions. And in Peter Cunningham's book, he describes an incident in 1826 involving Mary Ogilvie confronting the natives. The natives around Merton, the residents of Lieutenant Ogilvie RN, had remained all along on the most friendliest terms with the establishment, but during his absence were provoked into hostility by a party of soldiers and constables who had wantonly maltreated them. Mrs. Ogilvie was at home, surrounded by her young family and a few domestics, when the loud and threatening yells of a body of savages who had surrounded her dwelling suddenly aroused her attention and made her summon all her energies to meet the impending catastrophe. They had seized on 2 constables within a few yards of the door, whom they were shaking by the collars and reproaching in the most bitter terms their slight knowledge of English would admit of, preparatory to beating their brains out with their waddies, when Mrs. Ogilvie rushed fearlessly in amongst the brandished clubs and poised spears, by the firmness and persuasiveness of her manner, awed and soothed them into sentiments of mercy, and in half an hour they all parted, with all the members of the establishment upon the most cordial terms. William Ogilvie died on the 10th of March 1859 at Woolloomooloo, and the Merton estate passed into the hands of the White family. A visitor to Merton in 1895 described the cellars, and it was mentioned that they were almost unchanged from the days of William Ogilvie. It said a portion of the original convict buildings still remain, though the bulk of them of recent years have been demolished. It is wonderful looking at the solid cellars built in those days, now over 60 years ago, to note how true and faithful they are in construction, so good in fact that they're almost as perfect as the day they were finished, putting all the modern work quite in the shade. The Merton cellars, for example, into which Mr. White took me, show nothing more than in the way of decay after 60 years than one crack in the wall. These cellars were used in Captain Ogilvie's time for the purpose of storing wine, an extensive vineyard in those days being a feature of the place. Strolling around with Mr. Reginald White, many things at Merton arrest one's attention, recalling the days when Captain Ogilvie was in occupation. Among the old landmarks is a sundial, which was the only recorder of time to ring the consigned servants up and send them to meals and bed again, whilst alone the dial hangs the old bell that is used even to the present day for the same purpose. And that was an excerpt written in the Maitland Weekly Mercury on the 2nd of November 1895. Ellen Bundock, née Ogilvie, wrote a memoir of life in New South Wales, and this is in the collection of the Clarence River Historical Society. Part of her memoir was published in the Grafton Daily Examiner in 1932. Ellen Bundock was the daughter of William Ogilvie and sister of Edward Ogilvie. She married free settler Wellington Cochrane Bundock at Merton in 1841. She writes, "We remained a very short time in Sydney, part of which we spent at the hospitable house of the treasurer, Mr. Balcombe, who was an old friend and shipmate of our father. When we left Sydney, we went to Parramatta, where our father rented a cottage from the widow of Governor King. The heat and the myriads of mosquitoes, which are always worse to newcomers, made a lasting impression on my mind. But what was worse, they so stung my brother Edward, and the irritation was so great that our mother had to call in a doctor to his aid. We children and the luggage went up to Parramatta in an open boat, and I can still remember how tedious it was and how cold and hungry we were when we returned to Sydney in the same manner about 3 months afterwards on our way to Newcastle, where we were to live for a time so as to be nearer to our father, who was busy at Merton. Merton was the name of the village in Surrey where I was born, and our parents named Merton on the Hunter River, New South Wales after it, as they had lived there previous to coming to Australia. This was the Merton which was hallowed by the name of Nelson, whose favourite village it was and who'd lived there for some time, and our grandfather had his house afterwards. Our father, in common with many naval and military men, had received from the government an order to select a grant of land for 2,000 acres. His grant had originally been made out to Tasmania, but at the personal request of Sir Thomas Brisbane, the governor, he went to inspect some of the lands of this colony, and having seen the Upper Hunter, was so delighted with it he went no farther, the land being so good and scenery so fine. He returned there, therefore, taking a tent from Newcastle in which he camped until he had built a hut. We started from Newcastle, our father having come to fetch us on the Lord Liverpool, a small coasting vessel. The voyage occupied 2 days, a violent storm obliging us to put into Broken Bay. This voyage nowadays only takes 3 hours. None of us had felt the voyage all the way from England, except slightly the first few days, but my brother Edward and I were fearfully sick during this coastal voyage. We reached Newcastle, which was then a penal settlement governed by a commandant, Captain Francis Allman of the 48th Regiment, a Peninsular hero who'd been badly wounded at Albuera, who had a large family of children. He and his wife were nice, friendly people. The house we occupied was one built by the previous commandant, Colonel Morissette, who, unlike Captain Allman, had been a very cruel ruler over the convicts. In this house the government allowed us compartments. The chief difficulty was being provided with sufficient food. The butcher came to our mother saying he was sorry to disappoint her, but as she was his only customer he couldn't stay, but the government allowed us to buy salt pork from the commiserate stores. However, our fare was ameliorated by presents of game from the officers who were stationed there, one of whom, Captain Samuel Wright, who became our very fast friend. He afterwards settled about 10 or 12 miles from Merton, having obtained a grant of land. His pecuniary affairs caused him much anxiety, and he committed suicide, it is supposed, by drowning himself. He also was an old Peninsular officer in the Buffs. Shortly after his untimely end, gold was discovered in the colony and his land became very valuable. All we could get for meals for some time was from the convicts who sold the coarser part of their maize meal to our father. There was, however, a good baker in the place. The Allmans kindly supplied us with milk. Our father brought a great quantity of valuable things, ironmongery and others, and to guard these things we were allowed a constable who was a convict to live in the house, which constable was very soon detected selling them. Our mother, in her walks, was much struck with some smoothing irons a woman was using very skilfully, and on investigating them found that they were some of her own, which the constable had sold her. After about 8 or 9 months' residence at Newcastle, our father came for us and we started in an open boat for Wallace Plains, now called Maitland, where we expected only to stop for the night at a government residence, a place which only officials had the right to occupy. But it rained so heavily that night that in the morning the whole place was flooded, and in a lagoon where the plane had been, we saw blacks paddling their canoes, made of bark, the ends tied with courage bark and sealed with grass tree gum. We were detained in this house for some weeks by the floods. Mounted police, a body that had just been formed, were destined to inhabit this house and arrived to take possession while we were still occupying it. But the officer, a very gentlemanly man and very kind, would not have us disturbed and set his men to weave sticks of wattle between the veranda posts to accompany himself and them. At the end of a few weeks, the waters having subsided, we started for Merton in a very primitive conveyance, a covered cart drawn by a horse and bullock, lent by a neighbour, but most of the party, our mother included, preferred walking the journey. Of our party was one of the lady convicts I have mentioned, who became our cook. On the ship coming out, she was a cook to the women, and from her appearance and manner, our mother thought she would suit us, and she proved herself to be an honest and capable woman. Her name was Mary Partridge, and she stood 6 feet in her stockings, but did not appear so tall as she was so well proportioned. When we were alarmed by the blacks subsequently, we were much amused by her requesting her fellow servant William to conceal her in a small case. I must also mention a valuable acquisition to our party in the shape of a bull terrier presented to our mother by one of the officers stationed at Newcastle as a protection against the blacks. We found him useful on the load on one occasion when the dray carrying our luggage got bogged where the long bridge at Maitland now stands, the bullocks in what was then scrub resisting all efforts at being dug out. The bull terrier, Turpin, got loose, flew at their noses and so terrified them they made wild efforts and struggled out. This dog dreaded by the blacks, though very gentle with all of us, and his end was mysterious. We missed him, and on making inquiries through the blacks, heard he'd been seen walking towards a large waterhole that was very deep. We tracked to the edge of it, but there was no return track. Our energetic and clever mother was always busy, and she educated us all, but her great recreation was attending to her garden. We soon had a beautiful garden, orchard and vineyard, a great deal of which she planted with her own hands. From the vineyard our father made wine, which is still remembered for its excellence. A German named Luther, a highly educated man and a descendant of Martin Luther, on tasting the wine could not believe that it was not hock, and as he appeared skilful in the art of making wine, our father kept him on to assist him. The soil was considered very peculiar and turned out various wines, all excellent. It was also most favourable for all agricultural purposes and grew splendid wheat and tobacco. Amongst my recollections of my childhood was playing with my brother Fred outside the house, when on looking up we suddenly saw the whole hill covered with blacks, all armed to the teeth except the king or Chief Jerry, who was the most amiable to us, a fine dignified-looking man. He was clothed in an opossum skin rug and strips of fur, found the loins, and kept shaking hands with each of us in turn to convince his subjects that he was on friendly terms with us. Our father was absent in Sydney just then, so our mother was alone with us children and only a few men convicts about the place. The only weapon the chief had was a waddy stick in his belt, which was worn on all occasions by the natives. He kept going about amongst the other blacks trying to quieten them, and at last they filed away over the hills to our inexpressible relief, having only taken a little corn from the shed at hand and having shaken all of the constable's rations on the ground. The cause of all this trouble and of the blacks' anger was an act of treachery committed in the constable and soldiers who were left for our protection. The soldiers had persuaded some of the blacks to come to Merton under the pretence of seeking guides to go for bushrangers, but when the blacks came, they seized two of them, our Chief Jerry and another man, believing that this Jerry was a murderer of the same name for whom a reward was offered. Our mother, when going down to a small temporary garden she'd made by the river the evening before this appearance by the blacks, had seen the constable and soldiers struggling with two blacks, one of whom escaped and the other they forced into the hut. She immediately went to them and insisted on seeing the black that they had shut up, who proved to be Jerry, our chief, and on our mother declaring who he was, and that he was not the murderer, the soldiers released him, but fearing the indignation of the blacks at their treacherous dealing with them, they deserted us, clearing away in the night and leaving us to reap the consequences of their bad conduct, which might have resulted in the loss of all of our lives. For this disgraceful cowardice and disobedience to the orders of the constable and soldiers, the officer in command, Captain Lowe, wished to bring them to court-martial, but at our mother's intercession they were spared. The blacks said to the last that if they found the constable and soldiers they would have murdered them for their treachery. Our protective force was composed by the constable and the scourger whose business was to chastise the convicts, and 5 soldiers. Small as our home was, there was room for constant visitors, the governor, Sir George Gibbs, being amongst the number. Our mother was most successful with her convict servants, treating them kindly as she considered them to be highly moral. In many other places they were treated very harshly and with great suspicion, being locked up for the night, but the more confidence they were treated with, the better they behaved naturally. And this full account of Mary's early life was in the Daily Examiner on the 2nd of April 1932. And William Ogilvie's grave reads, William Ogilvie, Commander RN, came free 1825 on the ship Granada. Beneath this stone lies the mortal remains of William Ogilvie, Commander in the Royal Navy, born the 6th of February 1782, died the 5th of March 1859. In life tenderly beloved, in death most deeply lamented. And also buried there Mary White, who came free in 1825 on the ship Granada, his beloved wife, born the 10th of January 1788 and died the 23rd of August 1891, having survived him 23 years, during which she never ceased to mourn her irreparable loss. And William died at St Kilda House in Woolloomooloo, and he was 78, and he was buried at Camperdown Cemetery at Newtown. Mary was 95 when she passed away. So their son Edward, William Frederick Ogilvie's father, was born Edward David Stewart Ogilvie, and he was a pastoralist like his father, but he was also a member of the Legislative Council. He was born at Tottenham, Middlesex, England in 1814 and was 11 when his family emigrated to Australia. And Jim Belshaw put some information online, and it says it seems clear that the children were involved in property work from an early age. They were taught by their mother and also by their sister Mary. Edward was 12 when the frontier had broken out. He was home when a large party of armed blacks threatened the house. Young Edward himself had played with local Aboriginal children and had learnt to speak the local language. The escaped convict Richard Craig had discovered a huge river that was now called the Clarence while living with the Aborigines, and in 1840 he was pardoned for the discovery, and Craig took a massive party from Falconer's Plains near Guyra on the tablelands down to the Clarence, following the seasonal routes that he had learnt while living with the Bundjalung people. Craig's job was to get the group through the Clarence down to what had become known as Craig's Line, through some of the most rugged country in New England. The resulting journey was epic in its own right. Edward and Frederick asked to join Craig's party. They were denied though, and they pushed on as fast as possible with an Aboriginal, and they reached the Clarence at Tabulum ahead of Craig. They were the first white men to explore the area. Downstream, Edward took up 56 miles or 90 kilometres on both sides of the river, and he named the runs Yulgulbar. His brother Frederick died in 1846 at the age of only 30. His death notice states Frederick H. Ogilvie died tragically on the 20th of April 1846 at Yulgulbar Cottage, New South Wales, in the difficult frontier times from 2 burst blood vessels. And on a nearby low hill is a vault containing the grave of Frederick Ogilvie. In 1847, Edward Ogilvie was appointed a local magistrate. By 1850, Yulgulbar was about 300 square miles, 777 square kilometres, and this included Fairfield, a 100,000-acre cattle station in the mountains. Not unexpectedly, there were again troubles with the local Aborigines, but Edward quickly became fluent in the local dialect and at a parley explained that he only wanted the grass and gave them complete hunting rights on his run, including honey. In August 1854, Edward travelled to Europe, and for 2 years he travelled widely. He published the Diary of Travels in 3/4 of the globe in London in 1856 under the pseudonym An Australian Squatter. In this, he described his visits to the war front at the Crimea and his enchantment with Florence, where he had his portrait painted by Pietro Milani. Shortly before his return to Australia on the 2nd of September 1858, Edward married Theodosia Isabella de Burgh, daughter of Reverend William de Burgh, at Donnybrook Church, Dublin in Ireland. Edward was 44 and Theodosia 20. They returned to Yulgulbar in 1859 with a German craftsman and a vision of a major homestead. Yulgulbar Castle was built between 1860 and 1866. It had chandeliers, an Italian fountain and stone lions. The governor, Earl Belmore, stayed there in 1869. William and his wife and 8 of their daughters went to England in 1884. Theodosia died at Torquay in Devon, England in 1886, and Edward died in 1896. He left a life interest in Yulgulbar to his 6th daughter, Mabel Harriet Lillingston, wife of Charles A.G. Lillingston, but the castle began to decay. The furniture and effects were auctioned off in 1932. It has since been renovated and is a private home, but is not open to the public. Upon William's death, he was survived by 2 sons and 8 daughters. William Frederick Ogilvie, known as Bill, was born in 1862 in Sydney. In 1874, he was sent to Dublin for his education. He also studied modern history at Oxford University and returned to Australia by 1888, where he married Ethel Maud Milne on the 31st of October 1888 at St Mark's Church at Darling Point in New South Wales. They had 6 children together, and they lived at Ilperin, New South Wales, west of Glen Innes, and owned land there. And as mentioned in the outset of the episode, William Frederick Ogilvie died on the 15th of November 1920 at Usher's Metropolitan Hotel in Sydney. On the 22nd of November 1920, in the Moree Gwydir Examiner and General Advertiser, it announced the death of Mr. W.F. Ogilvie. William Frederick Ogilvie, 55, late of Ilperin Station, Matheson, near Glen Innes, and Keetar, Moree, was found dead at Usher's Hotel, Castlereagh Street, Sydney, on Thursday, stretched across a bed. He had a bullet wound in his forehead, and in his right hand was clasped a revolver containing 4 live cartridges and 1 shell. On the table were a number of telegrams addressed to his wife and children, stating his intention of committing suicide. Mr. Ogilvie was well known in the district and respected by those who were employed by him. Although eccentric in manner, he was a thoroughly kind, good-hearted man. And on the 30th of November 1920, in the Melbourne Argus, station owner's suicide, died worth £50,000. In Sydney, at the inquest concerning the death of William Frederick Ogilvie, who was found dead at Usher's Metropolitan Hotel on the 15th of November, it was stated that Ogilvie left a note addressed to the proprietor of the hotel stating, "I have decided to commit suicide for private reasons." The note also asked Mr. Usher to send some farewell telegrams addressed by Ogilvie to a member of his family and to communicate with his solicitor. Ogilvie lived with his wife and 6 children at Ilperin Station near Glen Innes. His estate was worth approximately £50,000 and his life insured for £1,000. He had been drinking rather heavily at the time of his death, which was caused by a bullet wound in the head. A finding of suicide was recorded. And then on the 23rd of September 1921, in the Sydney Sun, the will of the late William Frederick Ogilvie, grazier of Ilperin near Glen Innes, has for probate purposes been sworn in at £71,420. He bequeathed his household furniture and effects to his widow, as well as £1,000 for her immediate use. The residue of the estate Mr. Ogilvie bequeathed to his widow and children, the widow to receive the income during her lifetime. In 1930 through to 1949, Ethel was living at Wallara with 2 of their daughters, Ethel and Florinda, and Ethel died on the 26th of February 1951 at Darling Point in New South Wales at the age of 86. And on the 11th of March 1951, in the Sydney Truth, with the death of Mrs. Ethel Ogilvie, another link with the more gracious days has snapped. Mrs. Ogilvie was the widow of Mr. Bill Ogilvie of Ilperin, Glen Innes, and in the past their hospitality was known far and wide. William and Ethel's children, their firstborn was Nina Eileen. She was born in 1889. In the Sydney Sunday Times on the 11th of April 1915, it announces her wedding. The wedding of Eileen, eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. W.F. Ogilvie of Ilperin, Glen Innes, and Alexander Colin Anderson, eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. Duncan Anderson, formerly of Inverell, currently at London, took place at St. Mark's in Darling Point. Her ornaments were a pearl and diamond pendant, the gift of her grandmother, and a pearl brooch from the bridegroom. Miss Beatrice Ogilvie's sister was chief bridesmaid. The 3 younger bridesmaids included her other sister, Catherine, and it stated that their honeymoon was to be spent in Tasmania. In 1930, they lived at Garrawilla at Mulloway near Gunnedah, where Colin was a grazier. They had 6 children. One of their daughters, Beatrice Ann Anderson, had a child with Otway Faulkner from episode 158 in 1936 when she was 18. And if you'd like to go back and have a listen in that episode, however, I will recount one of the articles that relates to Beatrice. Grazier's divorce in Mexico. The validity of a grazier's divorce and remarriage in Mexico was questioned by the Supreme Court yesterday by Mr. Justice McClemens during the hearing of an application by the present Mrs. Faulkner for her son to spend part of his holidays with her. It would appear that Otway McLaurin Faulkner of Bunnockstud, Conago, believed that his marriage was bigamous, and Mr. Justice McClemens added he would not give a specific finding on the point. He was given judgment in a case in which Mrs. Beatrice Ann Faulkner was granted access to her son by a former marriage. The boy's father, Patrick William Lang, grazier of Cooma, divorced Mrs. Faulkner on the grounds of desertion in 1949 and challenged the application. Mr. Justice McClemens said that Mrs. Beatrice Ann Faulkner appeared to him as a cold, arrogant woman whose oath he could place little reliance. Patrick Lang's lawyer questioned the validity of the Faulkner's Mexican marriage on Friday. He said then that Faulkner, who had a wife and children in Australia, apparently obtained what was called a quickie divorce in Mexico to marry Mrs. Faulkner. Mr. Justice McClemens ruled that Mrs. Faulkner could have access to the boy on condition that the boy was not brought into contact with Faulkner or any member of Faulkner's family. He said to do otherwise would potentially do serious harm to the boy. The judge said he did not believe Mrs. Faulkner denied that she had any arrangement with Faulkner before leaving New South Wales to go to Mexico and get married there. The judge added that strictly there was no evidence that she did have an arrangement to go to Mexico. He had to consider carefully whether it was desirable for the child to be brought into contact with Faulkner. Mr. Justice McClemens added, the decent, ordinary little people who make up this community do not have the opportunity of going to Mexico if they want a divorce or remarriage. They have to obey the law of New South Wales, and if they enter into a bigamous marriage here, they're liable to be punished. Mrs. Faulkner's application to get the child to Palm Beach and bring him into contact with Faulkner's 4 children by previous marriage under these hothouse circumstances is one that should not be considered for one moment. That was in December 1954. Beatrice, known as Bet to the family, divorced Otway in 1976, and she died in 1975 in Sydney at the age of 86, and they had no children together. The next child of William and Ethel was Edward Douglas Ogilvie. He was born on the 6th of February 1891 in Bowral, New South Wales. In the Sydney Morning Herald on the 16th of April 1924, the engagement was announced between Edward and Dorothy Gaither Micklem. The marriage has been arranged and will shortly take place in Brisbane between Edward Douglas Ogilvie of Ilperin, Glen Innes, New South Wales, and Dorothy Gaither Micklem, only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. L.O. Micklem of the Valley of Lagoons in North Queensland. And this marriage occurred on the 23rd of June 1924 at St John's Cathedral in Glen Innes. Edward was 33 and Dorothy 20. They had 3 children, Griselda, Mary and Anne, and they also had a son that died at the age of 2. Edward died on the 26th of March 1968 at Glen Innes at the age of 77. And just a little bit on his daughter Griselda. She was born on the 25th of May 1925 in Glen Innes and grew up at Ilperin, family property. She attended Skeggs at Darlinghurst in Sydney and enlisted in World War II in the Australian Royal Women's Navy Service on the 1st of September 1943. A little over a fortnight later, on the 16th of September 1943 in the Glen Innes Examiner, Miss Griselda Ogilvie, eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. E.D. Ogilvie of Ilperin, has received her call-up for RANS. She was given leave on compassionate grounds on the 15th of January 1946, as this was when she married Dutch Lieutenant Isaac Rousseau, known as Jack, in Sydney. And the announcement of the wedding was in the Glen Innes Examiner on the 14th of May 1946. The wedding of Miss Griselda Ogilvie, eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. E.D. Ogilvie of Ilperin, Glen Innes, and Lieutenant Isaac Rousseau, NEI Air Force, only son of Mr. and Mrs. L.C. Rousseau of The Hague, Holland, took place at St Mark's Church in Darling Point on Saturday afternoon. The bride, who served in the RANS for 3 years, was attended by Miss Anne Ogilvie and a friend from Brisbane who also served in the RANS. A reception was held at the Pickwick Club, and the bride and bridegroom will make their home in Brisbane. And there's an article with a photo of Griselda in the Brisbane Telegraph on the 1st of June 1946 at the races with a friend, and it says that she's presently living in Brisbane but will leave later to make her home at Java. They lived in Java, which was then Dutch-controlled Batavia, before moving to Amsterdam, where Rousseau flew for the airline KLM. Their union ended in divorce, and Griselda moved to London and worked as a house model for the Horrocks agency. On the 4th of April 1951 in the Sydney Daily Mirror, Pat Bruce Smith is off to England in the Otrante in a fortnight to continue her interesting work in designing textiles. Her fellow traveller is Griselda Ogilvie. And on the 26th of August 1951, in the Sydney Truth, Patricia Bruce Smith and Griselda Ogilvie, who arrived from Sydney 3 months ago and share a flat near Belgravia, are covering several thousand miles by station wagon. When last heard of, they were sunbaking at Nice in the south of France. On the 11th of October 1951 in the Sydney Morning Herald, it says, boiling the billy all over Europe. Griselda Ogilvie of Glen Innes firmly established an old Australian custom when she toured the continent with 3 friends in an Austin van. And on the 1st of June 1952 in the Sydney Truth, Griselda Ogilvie has joined the ever-growing list of slender girls sought as models by well-known dress houses. She is now showing autumn fashions for Silhouette Deluxe. On the 13th of November 1952, in the Sun News Pictorial in Melbourne, 27-year-old mannequin Griselda Ogilvie returned in the Moulton yesterday after working in London for 18 months. Before she left Australia, Miss Ogilvie did a course at a mannequin school. She had no difficulty in obtaining work. Modelling was one job that Australians had difficulty in finding, she said. Secretarial work was harder to find, but certainly not impossible. While in London, she shared a flat with Miss Patricia Bruce Smith of Sydney in Westminster. And on the 18th of November 1952, in the Sydney Sun, an Australian girl who returned in the Moulton yesterday said she earned 15 guineas a week doing freelance mannequin work in London. She is attractive Glen Innes girl Miss Griselda Ogilvie, who modelled in several leading fashion houses, including Horrocks, where she took part in a parade before the Duchess of Kent, from which the Duchess chose frocks for her Far East tour. She was refused many jobs because she was not thin enough or tall enough. She's 5'7" tall, and 5'9" is required height for the mannequins in many fashion houses. She found time to tour the continent with Pat Bruce Smith of Rose Bay, who will be home at Christmas. And on the 15th of March 1953, in the Sydney Sunday Herald, Mr. and Mrs. Forbes Robertson Cummingham greeting Miss Griselda Ogilvie and her fiancé, Mr. Duncan Carson, at the ball following the Glen Innes picnic race meeting during the week. Miss Ogilvie and Mr. Carson will be married at St Stephen's Church, Macquarie Street, on the 28th of March. And in the Australian Woman's Weekly on the 18th of March 1953, thrilled with their new property at Guyra are Duncan Carson of the Downs, Glen Innes, and his fiancée, Griselda Ogilvie, Glen Innes, who will be married at St Stephen's, Macquarie Street. The reception will be held at the Australia. In the Sydney Daily Telegraph on the 29th of March 1953, it outlined the wedding. Visitors from Glen Innes, Merriwa and Queensland were among the guests of the marriage of Griselda Ogilvie and Duncan Carson yesterday afternoon. The bride is the eldest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. E.D. Ogilvie of Ilperin, Glen Innes. Mr. and Mrs. Carson will live on his property, Strathban, at Guyra. On the 29th of March 1953 in the Sydney Sun, many country people in town for the RAS Easter show attended the wedding of Griselda Ogilvie and Duncan Carson of Glen Innes. They had 2 children together, John and Rosemary, and after running their property near Guyra, they then went and ran Ilperin, the family property, and then the Downs at Glen Innes, before buying Welling Grove Station in 1959. They ran this for 17 years while raising their family. Starting in 1967, Griselda took over as the property manager of a 1,200-hectare mixed farm at Glen Innes and ran it successfully for 10 years. Duncan Carson moved to Sydney around the time that Griselda took over the property manager of that farm. They subsequently divorced, and Griselda ran the property in her own name. As well as proving to be an astute manager, she was also a skilled gardener, and she hosted garden fundraisers for the Red Cross and served as president of the Town and Country Club. Then Griselda moved to Sydney and bought a terrace house in Paddington, which she renovated. She teamed up with the writer Hugh Atkinson, who introduced her to the bohemian world of writers and artists, including David and Hermia Boyd and Donald Friend. She bought a house near her daughter in Lura in 1991, which she also renovated and continued to host garden events aiding the Red Cross. Griselda died on the 16th of April 2006 at the age of 80, and her ashes were interred alongside her parents' remains at Glen Innes. In a book called The Squatter's Castle, written in 1973 by George Farwell, it says, when female rural property managers were few and far between, Griselda Carson took over a mixed farm at Glen Innes, and despite critics' expectations, she ran it successfully. It was highly unusual in 1967 for a woman to be running a farm. Carson, who died at the age of 80, was born at Glen Innes, the eldest of 6 daughters. A 5th-generation Australian, she represented the 3rd generation of the family in the district. Her family, the Ogilvies, were early settlers in New South Wales, having emigrated in the 1830s and first putting down roots in the Hunter and then at Yargulbar on the Clarence River near Grafton, where her forebears built a castle. Carson grew up on the family property Ilperin at Glen Innes. Originally, nearly 5,000 hectares was taken up by her grandfather, William Ogilvie, and after his death it was run by her father, Edward. And just a little on her sister, Anne. On the 30th of May 1952, it outlines her marriage. Miss Anne Ogilvie, second daughter of Mr. and Mrs. E.D. Ogilvie of Ilperin, Matheson, married Peter Carter at St Mark's Church in Sydney, the son of Dr. and Mrs. R.B. Carter of Mudgee. So moving on to the 3rd child of William and Ethel Ogilvie. She was Helena Maud, who was born on the 17th of April 1892 at Ilprin at Glen Innes. She married Ernest Edward Duckett White in 1918 at Wallara in New South Wales when she was 26 and Ernest 39. They were second cousins. And a small article says Mrs. Ernest White of Bluff Downs is a very well-known figure in the Queensland Country Women's Association. She has been in touch with the development of the whole movement ever since its inception in Queensland and was the first president of the Dalrymple district, which embraced 8 branches. Mrs. White is one of the Milne family, which gave Lola Seaside Home to the association and made it possible for hundreds of tired country mothers and children to avail themselves of an opportunity for a holiday and a change of scene from outback places of northern, central and western Queensland, while many from the southern area also enjoy the privileges of lots. Mrs. White is one of the eloquent speakers in the association and is always an asset to the Northern Division. They had a daughter, Sylvia Duckett White, who was born on the 6th of May 1920 in Queensland, and Helena died on the 6th of May 1944 in Toowoomba, aged 52. And a little note on her death said that she was formerly Miss Helena Maud Ogilvie, second daughter of the late Mr. W. F. Ogilvie of Ilprin, Glen Innes, and granddaughter of the late Mr. E. D. Ogilvie, MLC, of Yalgabar, Clarence River. She was married in 1918 and made her home at Bluff Downs, Charters Towers. After that, they purchased Truganini at Toowoomba, and they'd lately lived at Woodlands. She's survived by her husband and daughter. And their daughter, Sylvia Duckett White, married George Bassingthwaite. And then her husband, Ernest Edward Duckett White, died in 1956 at Woodlands, Greenmount, Queensland. He was one of the best-known livestock breeders in Australia, and he died aged 77. He was the eldest son of the late Albert William Duckett White and grandson of the late Honorary William Duckett White, MLC, who went to Queensland from Ireland in 1847 and purchased Beaudesert Station at Ninduin Bar on the Logan and Bluff Downs at Charters Towers. The late Mr. E.E.D. White was born at Bluff Downs, which passed into his hands on the death of his father in 1914. The late Mr. White was best known to Australian cattle breeders as stud master of the Woodlands Hereford stud, which he bred to withstand the harsh conditions in the tropical North Country. Some years ago, he made over the stud to his son-in-law and daughter, Mr. and Mrs. George Bassingthwaite. Mr. White was educated at the King's School. He also interested himself in public affairs in general and was actively associated with the Dalrymple Shire Council and the Graziers Association. Mr. White was also one of the most successful bloodstock breeders in Queensland. Until his recent retirement, he was vice chairman of the Queensland Turf Club. And then there was also an appreciation article written by Henry Lamond. With the recent passing of Ernest White, we lose a stockmaster and a gentleman. He served with distinction in the First War. He managed his property with skill. And as with the Annings, his name is not part of a North Queensland pastoral history. It is history. He loved his properties. He bred the best stock horses and cattle. And he was a just employer. I heard of him swimming a fast-running creek in flood just to have the fun of battling the current. I first saw him when he was presiding at a vice-regal banquet. Without bothering to change his clothes and only altering his manner to fit the occasion, he immediately took the chair at another meeting, which decidedly was not graced by royalty. He met all men fairly, whether opposed to them or in their favour. My outstanding impression of him was at a meeting of the UGA. I had prepared a speech which would raise blisters on an iron tank. Mr. White met me before the meeting and listened to what I had to say. He agreed I had a just grievance. He passed this remark: "It's so damn easy to be destructive. The hard part is to be really constructive." I did not deliver that speech. He was noted as a sportsman, but I prefer to remember him as a stockmaster and a gentleman. The next child was Ethel Beatrice. She was born on the 2nd of June 1894 in Glen Innes. She died on the 26th of May 1958 at Double Bay, New South Wales, and she didn't marry. Their next daughter was Florinda Catherine. She was born in 1902 in Glen Innes. In 1930, she was living with her mother at Wallara and was working as a secretary, and she didn't marry. She's featured on the 27th of November 1943 in the Sydney Sun under the heading of the University of Sydney. And it says, "The notice is hereby given that on the 16th of December 1943, the date of the election of fellows of the Senate, that the following candidates have been communicated to qualify for voting." And Miss Florence Catherine Ogilvie, MBE, BA, had been nominated by Professor H. Tasman Lovell. And Florinda died in 1983. The next child was John Milne Ogilvie, who was born on the 28th of January 1902 in Glen Innes. On the 23rd of October 1934, in the Glen Innes, Examiner announced his engagement to Margaret Beryl McRae, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. L.H.D. McRae of Macquarie Street, Sydney. And on the 20th of February 1935, in the Sydney Morning Herald, of social interest was the wedding celebrated last night at the Cameron Memorial Church at Glen Innes of Miss Margaret Beryl McRae and John Milne Ogilvie. On the 9th of June 1944, it mentions that John Ogilvie owned Cherry Tree, Farrarabad at Glen Innes. They had 3 children, and he died on the 11th of August 1986 in Glen Innes at the age of 84. So it seems even men that end up being of quite notable pastoralist families have their own demons. However, his children did go on to achieve in their own right. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.